Pledge of allegiance.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
I've reviewed the index minutes for the City Council meeting for August 25th, 2020. Are there any motions to correct or amend the minutes? Without any, I am approving them. Do we have any committee meeting requests or reports? So, any comments from council? Mr. Waxler.
Yeah, last week we talked about those boxes where people were putting stuff out in front of them, and there's lots of trash. And I've been watching them this week, and they're not any better. They're actually worse. I think I talked to people that had them. They don't pay nothing to put them there. They just put them there. They asked, but they put them there. And there's no money exchanged, but a couple of places I talked to had them picked up already because they didn't maintain them. And their businesses look bad. So I would like to make a motion that we just don't allow those in the city. I'd like somebody to have Sean do an ordinance or whatever that we need to do, but I don't think we want them in the city.
So you've made a motion for an ordinance eliminating the clothes bin donations within
The
City of Defiance. So
Is there an effective date, maybe the first of the year, 2020?
Whatever you think we need to do. I mean, that's your spot.
So we have the motion.
I'll second it.
I'll second.
We have the second, Mrs. Crutch.
Mr. Rusty?
I have a question.
Sure.
What was the clarity on the type of charity that you want to close?
I want to get rid of them boxes that are out there in front of these businesses that they're not maintaining. They're just trash thrown from. The clothes that's in them are getting
In
soaking wet.
general?
What? Yeah,
I'm
in
gonna talk
general.
directly to a councilman. Is the question that the closing of the boxes are in general or specifically?
So that's a good clarification. Are we talking an ordinance to eliminate all clothing donations?
Just
Or just-
the boxes. I mean, people could still take stuff to the clothes closet of the churches or Goodwill, whatever.
The
Just not the
private,
boxes out in.
private business boxes that
Right.
are placed in front of,
Yeah, I don't know what you call them. Do you have a suggestion on what we call those?
They're just clothing donation boxes. All there is to it.
Mr. Rusty.
Well, get the second, then I guess we can debate it. There's already a second, correct?
Yes, there is.
Is it basically boxes in the public places or boxes also in the private sectors?
That's a good question.
I'm not aware of any of these boxes that are on our city rights of way or city property. I know that the mayor had come up with a Excel spreadsheet of all the locations in town. I don't have that in front of me, but I believe, Mr. Grestry, that most of those, if not all of those, were on private property.
And that's, I guess, so does the motion need to specify that in the public setting, not the private setting, or also public and private? If one is to be in the private sector. Donation box.
Well, I would draft it broad enough that it would cover public and private locations, unless I was directed otherwise. But my recommendation to you would be generally simpler is better for legislation and for ease of compliance. So I would make it universal until you direct it otherwise.
All right.
Quick question.
Mrs.
Mr.
Crutch.
Wexler, did you talk to the businesses and they said that they don't receive any kind of
And the
monetary?
people come and ask to put them there. They're set there. There's no money exchanged. But the businesses don't even know where the stuff goes to.
Right.
You know, like I said, there was two of them I talked to that said they used to have them. They had them picked up because they were such a bad influence in front of their stores with stuff just piled around and nobody would come and clean it up, so.
Mr. Mast?
I did some fairly extensive online research through articles on this stuff. And basically these things, they collect the clothing and they sell it by the pound. And any charity that might be on the box could get a pittance. You're talking cents per $100 from some of the articles I read. But the majority of it is sold per pound and usually overseas or well out of the city of Defiance at the very least. So they're not doing a lot for anything local anyhow.
Okay, thank you. We do have a motion on the floor and a second. Mr. O'Donnell?
Just a point of clarification, Mr. President. I know some churches and parishes that are, because of the COVID restrictions, they're having people set the items like outside the doorways and pile them up outside, the items and the food. Would you like for me to exempt like churches and houses of religion in this ordinance?
But the ones that I know that are doing that and having to put outside are cleaning it up every day.
Okay.
So
You know, they're not leaving it out in the weather or anything else. They just don't want people going in and making contact with other people and stuff. So they are going out, at least I know two of them that are. They're going out and picking it up every day. They got people that do that, so.
So I could write exclusionary language to that effect.
Yeah, I mean,
This ordinance
you
will
know,
not
you don't
apply
want
to
to
that.
stop all the donations. There was a lot of that stuff that goes to good causes and is free, but like Josh said, these boxes aren't even, they're doing no good for the city of Defiance outside of making it look like trashy.
So you're suggesting that the for-profit endeavors for clothing donations, as opposed to a 501c3, a tax exempt
all
like
that is.
charity, like a school or a church or something like this, that perhaps you're suggesting the ordinance be for for-profit businesses that solicit clothing donations, like those boxes.
Well, yeah, but I think some of the other places some of your churches do get profit off of, but it's all donated money then.
Right.
You know, they take money in, but it don't stay at that facility. It goes to
But
to
a
food
church would be
banks
a
and
501c3
I don't know
tax
what all the
exempt.
numbers are, so I can't answer that, so.
A nonprofit sort of charity or church organization is not what you're suggesting.
Yeah, that's
Perhaps
not
these
what I'm suggesting.
for-profit
Right.
businesses where you donate money, they make money on it. You
Right.
donate clothes, they make money on it. Right, specifically. Mr. Leonard?
Perhaps maybe one of the main problems that we have with these types of boxes, and what you have to ask yourself is, because the reason we want to really look at banning them is because there's trash outside those boxes. Well, that could certainly meet the definition of a public nuisance when you see those kind of things. So maybe what we need to do is maybe look at the nuisance code as well to see if it fits anywhere in our nuisance ordinances. Because trash and debris, there's these 5 different things, and I don't know off the top of my head exactly what's public nuisance, but there's usually 5 things that meet the definition of a public nuisance. So maybe what we should do is take a look at our nuisance code as well to see if that criteria is being met. If you would cite a property owner who has these boxes outside their business and say we're going to issue a public nuisance because somebody's not maintaining them, you might find that these people would say, please remove these boxes because I'm not going to actually try to work at this when people are not being responsible enough to put them in the box and it looks orderly. So let's not forget that we do have some codes that meet the criteria of a public nuisance, especially with trash and debris, that we should maybe take a serious look at to see if it meets that criteria, because generally speaking, maybe we have a public nuisance, and if we don't, maybe we could broaden the scope of what constitutes a public nuisance, especially with some of these boxes not being maintained.
But the only problem you got with public nuisances, Jeff, is there's no, they don't do nothing about it. They put a sign in the yard
Yeah.
and then the people wait until it's time and then they mow the yard or we go mow it, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah,
I know what you're
absolutely.
saying, what you're trying to
Yeah,
say, but
no, I
I don't
agree.
think that's gonna work with this situation.
Well, it might not, but that doesn't mean that you can't reinforce it as well with some newer language in it to strengthen it.
Generally, the junk piling, the dumpster type rubbish nuisances are some of the easiest to enforce because we often have seasonal help that can just gather those items, take them to the dumpster, and then we can then send that person a bill, that property owner a bill, or send it over to certify it to the county auditor as a lien on the property, so that those aren't as difficult to enforce. And I think one of the things Mr. Leonard might be getting at is maybe for your motion, adding a definition in that section 1317.01 that defines something about these clothing bins as a public
Right.
nuisance.
Oh, yeah, Mr. Hancock.
And to follow up with a nuisance, normally if a nuisance is cited, it goes to the property owner, is that correct? And if that's the case, then, let's say, for example, over by ProMedic and Wooded Acres, okay, there's an area there. The nuisance would be cited to the property owner, and then the property owner would be taking care of that nuisance itself. So, I mean, I think it's great that we have organizations in town. I also feel that we have churches and other social outreach programs that this may affect, if we put this ordinance too tight. Because there's other ones that are more than welcome, and they do keep them local. I know some of the donation boxes, have clothing, other ones have additional items. That's what the food is what's gonna cause the rodents, the other pests to come in. I don't think the clothing may have as much of an effect. But I think the nuisance may be the direction we may wanna work with, even though we've already seconded that motion to put an ordinance together, so that's how I feel. Thank you.
Mr. Corbett.
If you're trying to enforce it through that nuisance ordinance though, and the property owner is the one that's gonna be responsible, and the assumption is that they're going to contact the owner of that box to get it removed. And they have no success, because obviously if they cared about those boxes, they'd be out there picking this stuff up and it wouldn't look like that. Why is it fair to punish the property owner for their lack of response, is my question, if you enforce it that way, rather than just make an ordinance that says, in Defiance, we won't have these type of collection boxes? That's my question.
I don't necessarily have an answer for that, because I think the whole point is to take care of the problem. And in taking care of the problem, you can sort of skin that cat in a number of different ways. It depends on what council's preference would be. If somebody has their business and they find that it's being accumulating trash because people are dumping it and it's supposed to be used as a clothing bin, I would say, I know it, I don't look at it as punishing the property owner. I would just say, this needs to be taken care of, and people would think twice about putting them down because of the problem. I don't have no problem with banning them if that's what we want to do. I think that will be council's choice in the long run.
Mr. Engel.
I do know they're pro-medical, like what John was saying. I don't even think there's a business there anymore. There's an empty building, so what happens there? I mean, would the city have to end up and go ahead and find out?
Still the property owner's responsibility.
But who's gonna contact the property owner if there's nobody there? How are we gonna find out who it is?
We're going to abate the nuisance, and then we're going to put a lien on the property after notifications are taken care of.
I really think we need to ban them, because I don't think the nuisance sign's gonna do any good.
Yeah.
My opinion, but.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's the choice that I think in the debate that has to take place.
That's
Mr.
fine.
Resting.
I think Mr. Leonard is correct in the way he's thinking, that we do need to put teeth in our nuisance ordinance Because in essence, you have to have something that prevails if you don't have cooperation from the owners, or if you have an issue that's out there, it's gonna be classified as a nuisance anyways. Unless, I guess, how do you enforce it if it's not under that umbrella?
Right.
And I guess what I'm saying is, Mr. Waxler has the motion, he's got the second, and it's going to be determined. But I think in the same sense, we need to basically maybe relook at our nuisance code and maybe put something in there to add some teeth to this so that we can also resolve it through there at the same time.
Which brings us to a good point. We do have a motion and a second on the floor. Please. And the motion is for an ordinance to be drawn up for clothing donation boxes, for-profit businesses to be banned from the city of Defiance. Does that sound about right?
Mr. Rusty,
No.
Mrs. Crutch.
Yes.
Mr. Waxler,
Yes.
Mr. Mast,
Yes.
Mr. Engel,
Yes.
Mr. Corbett,
Yes.
and Mr. Hancock.
No. Five two?
Yeah.
Yeah, so
Sean needs to do an ordinance.
would you please draw one up for our review?
I will.
Okay. So, Mr. Waxler, do we have any other comments from council? No? All right, I just have one thing to mention, that if people who usually view city council meetings would like to go to YouTube and review the live stream, because we're currently up and live streaming city council meetings, please do, with the caveat that we are currently beta testing. We're brushing out some of the knots, and so if everything isn't 100%, that's the learning curve we're facing. Give it a couple weeks and we will. But we're currently live streaming our city council meetings. But that's all that I have in front of me.
Announce that so they know where to go. City of Defiance Ohio Council meeting.
Oh, they can, in the search bar, put City of Defiance, Ohio Council Meeting, and that will bring it up on YouTube? Excellent.
Yep.
To the Board of Control, Mayor McCann's not here this evening, but Mr. Leonard.
I have nothing at this time.
Oh, thanks. Mr. O'Donnell.
I have nothing as well.
Mr. Leonard.
I have nothing at this time.
At this time. All right, but we do have a number of legislative issues in front of us this evening, which does bring us to our first ordinance.
Third reading by caption only, an ordinance authorizing a lease agreement for part of the property located at 629 Arabella Street to the Board of Education of Defiance City School District.
Mr. O'Donnell.
Mr. President, a little over a year ago, this body made the decision based on an upswell of public support for what is referred to as the 1918 building, that if it were to go away or be demolished, it would not be due to an arbitrary artificial state deadline. And so the city council decided that you would enter into negotiations with the city school district to try and acquire title to that property. We have been proceeding apace with those negotiations, and this ordinance before you is an attempt to patch a roadblock for the city to acquiring this property. It's a sort of like a sale leaseback agreement. It's a lease agreement with the city school district for a portion of that property that has some title issues, more specifically a reversionary clause. And what this does is it gives us time to work out the issues with that reversionary clause and try to acquire that property in fee simple absolute. Based on the Defiance Area Foundation Agreement, we have until about spring of 2024 as a guarantee for any kind of demolition funds to be used. However, you should know under this agreement, if the city does not take ownership of it, that 5-year, 60-month timeframe that the foundation generously afforded us, if it stays with the school district, if the property stays with the school district, that becomes a 2-year guarantee. So when you're deliberating this tonight, I would recommend that you keep that in mind.
Thank you. Do we have any questions or comments from council? Mr. Hancock?
As a city councilman as well as an employee of Defiance City Schools, I need to recuse myself from this conversation and what's remaining for this ordinance.
Thank you. Mr. Waxler?
No further question, most suspend the call.
Oh, yeah, you know what? I'm sorry. I meant to say this is a third reading, Mr. Weiser. I'm sorry about that. I had it in my notes. So you're not able to suspend and call this right now. It would just be either a motion to adopt or table. Or
Okay, I'll make a motion to adopt.
So we have with no further questions, we have a motion to adopt.
Second.
Second, Mr. Corbett?
Mrs. Crutch?
Yes.
Mr. Waxler?
Yes.
Mr. Mast?
Yes.
Mr. Engel?
No.
Mr. Corbett?
Yes.
Mr. Hancock?
Abstain.
And Mr. Rusty?
Yes.
And with that, the ordinance is adopted.
First reading by caption only, an ordinance authorizing additional expenditures for the professional design of the granulated activated carbon filter project and declaring emergency.
Mr. Leonard?
Yes. As part of an ongoing process with GAC, if you go back, we actually went through a qualification process where Stan Tech was the winning engineering firm to come in and engineer GAC. Since that time, what you do is you go back and forth and negotiate a price on engineering. And you come up to some kind of agreement after you sit down with the engineer and negotiate what it's going to cost to actually, for engineering services on this project. And I think at this point, the project's $10 million.
$9.9 million.
$9.9 million. So what you do is you submit your plans to EPA where they can look at it, and then they make additional suggestions. And I must tell you that there were quite a few going back and forth with EPA, and what transpired from there is that it actually increased the cost, and the engineering firm is asking for additional compensation for that. For example, I can tell you that there's a recarbonization bypass basin put into this where we have the ability, if we ever need to bypass a certain process in the water plant, we've kept ourselves open to that because you may not need that necessarily process in the future, and we wanted to keep it open in case we didn't. There are a number of other things that the EPA and Stantec and our engineer sat down to negotiate with, which was putting a permanent generator in the facility. In case we ever lost power, you could actually tie into a permanent generator, and a lot of what we have today are these mobile generators that we've used in the past. But EPA really, and I think our water plant superintendent as well, looked at, there was like a load study that had to be done for the generator, and there were a number of things that added to the cost. And what you see before you tonight is an ordinance increasing those costs to $152,900. Other kind of issues is you had motorized access gates that come in and out of the plant. We had certain electrical coordination for a sludge press. One of the things that we're considering doing in the future is right now from that water plant that's pumped underneath the roadway and it goes over to that facility off of Jackson, and the sludge beds are over there, and all that sludge is getting pumped right now into those beds. We have made modifications to actually pump it to a sludge press and actually press it and do it in such a way that it might create the kind of material that a farmer or a business person might want in the future if you can combine it with other material. It could be compost material, it could be a number of things. We wanted to leave those options open for the future, so they've modified the plans to take a look at that as well. Additional security cameras was something that, as they sat down and looked at it, we wanted to leave those options. Secure area, especially when you're making water and really creating a more secure area with cameras and fencing and those kind of things were important to water plants, and it's important to this one as well. So there were a number of things that drove these costs up, and I think what we're asking council to approve, and actually as we've gone through them, they've been negotiated back and forth, and this has been kind of the final price of additional cost to that engineer. And what we're asking council to do tonight is pass this so we can move on. I believe it is on an emergency. We want to move forward with the engineering plans. I know that these are the kind of things in big projects that pop up from time to time. But I can tell you that in terms of sort of keeping our finger on it, our city engineer has worked with our water superintendent and the consultant and with EPA to look at these things. And I think we're in agreement that we want to move forward with these. Not all the things were at the mercy of the consultant wanting something. The superintendent wanted some of those things as well, because it gave us some flexibility down the road in case we wanted to modify a process, or in case we wanted to maybe look at the sludge. We spend $400,000, John, maybe on sludge removal right now.
Close.
Yeah, and I think what we're trying to do is, that's a number that constantly is year after year after year. When you think of the soot and the process, we need to find a better way to deal with sludge. And I think we want to keep our options open to look at a sludge press and see if we can maybe take in some of those costs and cut them down and make it the plant a bit more efficient and the water plant process a bit more efficient. So we're asking council to move forward with these changes, and we ask that you approve this tonight.
Right. And just for clarification's sake, on the ordinance, when first cited, it's on the 4th whereas, it cites 152,580.
Oh,
And on the section 1, it says 152,850. I'm sure one of them.
That would be a scrivener's error. And
I would-
I think you have the RFL there.
the matrix that I have says 152,900, so that's another third one. But this says 152,850.
850?
Okay, so we'll correct that.
Yeah.
Okay. Questions from council? Mr. Hancock?
With this ordinance, the 152,850 is just for professional services. This doesn't include all of the other items that you just mentioned, Mr. Leonard. Do you have any idea what additional cost those will be? That we mentioned, like security cameras, the new
Yeah.
sludge system.
I actually have a
'Cause I'm
matrix.
assuming that they're gonna be forthcoming and they weren't included in the previous ordinance that went through the GAC approval.
The bottom line number is in the ordinance, but I can give you this matrix for this change log that actually breaks down 15 different items and costs associated with those items and the hours that pertain to these items as well for a breakdown. So it gives you a breakdown of all that.
Do you know what the financial difference is or how much the financial total is for them compared to the 152,850? to 850.
Well, this is an additional, amount to the engineer, okay? So, the original.
We had budgeted, I believe, $700,000 for the engineering on this. And up to this point, we had already contracted with them for around between $500,000 and $600,000.
So we're within range.
And the additional items that are in the matrix that Mr. Leonard is talking about, they total 152 and change. So the total engineering cost is still gonna be somewhere close to the 700,000 we had originally budgeted.
Okay,
None of that includes the upcoming construction project, which will be this $9.9 million, and that'll come in separate legislation. That'll come to you later. But this is all just for engineering that has already begun. It's basically a change order for engineering that has already begun.
okay. Thank you.
Mr. Waxler?
You're just talking sludge press. We already tried that once
Right.
and didn't work, or
No, it certainly, worked. I don't think as it sits right now that it was something that financially with GAC coming before us that we could necessarily afford that. I think that the superintendent certainly feels that that's still a possibility. And I think that one of the modifications that you see is making it, the plant capable of, having that, whether it's an electrical issue and setting it up. I think that, he actually talks about it in terms of, electrical design to provide capped conduits from electrical room to outside the GAC facility for future extensions. So he wants to make it, available from an electrical standpoint in the plant, so they had to modify that. So he wants to keep the options open to look at that somewhere down the road.
okay, because I know a couple years ago we did that and it wasn't successful, or
We had
the reason we didn't stick with it.
We had tested some sludge press mechanism on kind of a smaller scale, as long as sitting on top of a tractor. It wasn't gonna be suitable at all for the quantity that we produce out of the water plant, but that doesn't mean there aren't larger systems that could meet the need, and I think it's just anticipating that someday that might be something we would wanna pursue.
It wasn't originally in the plan. He wanted to make sure from an electrical standpoint that we had the capability to do it.
Any other questions? What
No
council's
further
wishes?
discussion, motion to suspend and call.
We have a motion to suspend and call? Second. Second, Mr. Mast?
Mr. Mast,
Yes.
Mr. Engel,
Yes.
Mr. Corbett,
Yes.
Mr. Hancock,
Yes.
Mr. Rusty,
Yes.
Mrs. Crutch.
Yes.
And Mr. Waxler.
Motion adopt.
Motion to adopt, Mr. Engel. Second, Mr. Waxler?
Mr. Engel,
Yes.
Mr. Corbett,
Yes.
Mr. Hancock,
Yes.
Mr. Rusty,
Yes.
Mrs. Crutch,
Yes.
Mr. Waxler,
Yes.
and Mr. Mast.
Yes.
And this ordinance is also adopted.
Initial there. I don't have the mayor initial. First reading by caption only. An ordinance providing for the issuance and the sale of bonds in a maximum principal amount of $835,000 for the purpose of paying costs that are approved in the municipal water works system by constructing improvements to stabilize embankment abutting the city's water treatment plant near the confluence of the Maumee and the Tiffin rivers in order to protect and preserve the city's water treatment plant, water supply and related water supply facilities, and declare an emergency.
Mr. Leonard?
Yes, thank you. Actually, if you don't mind, I'm gonna try and tackle my explanation for the next four ordinances in one shot. Last week, I'd given the council a heads up that this ordinance or this set of ordinances was coming. And I provided you tonight a handout that breaks down a little bit of what I talked about last week. So this first ordinance for $835,000 is would be represented over on the right-hand side of this sheet, new money, $740K. So all the ordinances are written with basically not to exceed language. So the ordinance says not to exceed or the maximum principal amount of $835,000. The amount we'll actually anticipate issuing would be the number below that, 755,000. So in total, the ordinances are gonna be 7,890,000, but the projected issue is actually the $7,160,000 number. The first one here, $835,000, new money. This would be to basically to reimburse the water plant for the money we put out earlier to correct or to fix the slope, the landslide that occurred at Maumee, or on Maumee Riverbank below the water plant. The second ordinance, and I'm going right to left out on these columns, the second ordinance, $1,125,000, is also new money. That is in anticipation of the amount of money the city will need to come up with for the Cleveland Ottawa roundabout. Roughly $1 million, and that is over and above approximately $2 million in grant funding we received for that project. So a lot of money is at stake, and we need to come up with the match. And because of the good timing, because of the current market rates, it's just a good time to borrow that money now, even though that project is slated for 2021. So that new money, if I go down to the bottom of the sheet that I handed out, the new money will actually cost us about $194,000 a year in principal and interest payments over the 10-year period, $1,943,000. So new money we're borrowing for new purposes. The next four columns over, and the third and fourth ordinance that we're going to go over tonight, would be the refunding of money we've issued previously. In 2011, we borrowed money to build a municipal court next door. And again, advantageous rate environment, makes sense to refund this money, essentially like refinancing your house. Again, if I go down towards the bottom of that column, what you'll see is the approximate annual savings on that piece will be about $22,500 a year. Total over the life of the loan will be savings of $270,000. That's $270,000 over the next 10 years over what we would currently pay if we didn't do the refunding. Similarly, the next column over, the next three columns over actually would be refunding of money that we issued in 2019, just last year. And again, rates are attractive enough that it makes it worthwhile to build this in to this bond issue to make the size of the total issue attractive enough to encourage the best rates that we can get. It's a bidding process, by the way, and so everything we can do to lower that interest rate saves the city money. The sewer utility 2019, that was money that we had issued towards our combined sewer overflow efforts. The $655,000 in the second to the left column would be money we borrowed for actually the very GAC engineering that we were talking about a little while ago. And then in the first column, $1,950,000 would be money we borrowed last year for the replacement of citywide water meters. The savings, again, you can see on an annual basis in the case of the water meter project. Well, you know what? Let me go to the far right-hand column, bottom right corner. Of the refunded annual savings, $59,800 a year, that would be the money that we'll actually save year to year across the water and sewer funds and a little bit in the $22,000 in the capital fund. Total savings over the life of the debt, $271,000. The reason that it's a 10-year bond, the reason that total savings is not $59,800 times 10 to give you $590,000 is because these bonds are actually due in 9 years. We're going to refinance them over 10 years. So we'll pay an extra year, but the annual amount each year will come down. So on a year-by-year basis until the last year, we will see the $59,000 a year in savings, but over the total life, it'll be the $271,000. Sorry to be long-winded on that. As I go through each one of these, of course, I'll be happy to answer any specific questions. As you know, from past bond issues, before we take a vote on any of these issues, on each one of them, I'm required to read a fiscal officer's certificate. So I will start with the certificate for this first bond issue or bond ordinance, unless there are any questions before I do that.
Any questions before he does that?
So, to the Council of the City of Defiance, Ohio. As fiscal officer of the City of Defiance, Ohio, I certify in connection with your proposed issue of bonds in the maximum aggregate principal amount of $835,000 for the purpose of paying costs of improving the municipal waterworks system by constructing improvements to stabilize an embankment abutting the city's water treatment plant near the confluence of the Maumee and Tiffin rivers in order to protect and preserve the city's water treatment plant, water supply, and related water supply facilities, together with all necessary appurtenances thereto, that 1, the estimated life or period of usefulness of the improvement is at least 5 years. 2, the estimated maximum maturity of the bonds, calculated in accordance with section 133.20 of the revised code, is 40 years.
Thank you. Do we have any questions from council for Mr. Leonard?
No questions, motion to suspend and call.
If we have no questions, we have a motion to suspend and call.
Second, Mr. President.
Second, Mr. Corbett.
Mr. Corbett?
Yes.
Mr. Hancock?
Yes.
Mr. Rusty?
Yes.
Mrs. Crutch?
Yes.
Mr. Waxler?
Yes.
Mr. Math?
Yes.
And Mr. Engel?
Yes.
Motion to adopt, Mr. Waxler. Second, Mr. Mast.
Mr. Hancock?
Yes.
Mr. Rusty?
Yes.
Mrs. Crutch?
Yes.
Mr. Waxler?
Yes.
Mr. Math?
Yes.
Mr. Engel?
Yes.
And Mr. Corbett?
Yes.
Ordinance is adopted. Yeah. So we can be orderly about this.
Yes. First reading by caption only. An ordinance providing for the issuance and the sale of bonds in the maximum principal amount of $1,125,000 for the purpose paying costs of improving the intersection of State Route 15, Ottawa Avenue, and Cleveland Avenue by constructing a roundabout and related middle island, including installation of the sidewalk and the multi-use paths, and declaring emergency.
Mr. Leonard.
Yes, thank you. And again, this is the money for next year's Cleveland Ottawa Avenue roundabout project. To the Council of the City of Defiance, Ohio, as fiscal officer of the City of Defiance, Ohio, I certify in connection with your proposed issue of bonds in the maximum aggregate principal amount of $1,125,000 for the purpose paying costs of improving the intersection of State Route 15, Ottawa Avenue, and Cleveland Avenue by constructing a roundabout and related middle island, including installation of sidewalks and multi-use paths, together with the necessary related improvements and appurtenances thereto. That 1, the estimated life or period of usefulness of the improvement is at least 5 years, and 2, the estimated maximum maturity of the bonds calculated in accordance with section 133.20 of the revised code is 20 years.
Thank you. Any questions for Mr. Leonard in these regards? Mr. Corbett?
Questions, motion to suspend and call, Mr. President.
Motion, Mr. Corbett. Second,
Second.
Mr. Engel.
Mr. Rusty?
Yes.
Mrs. Crutch?
Yes.
Mr. Waxler?
Yes.
Mr. Math?
Yes.
Mr. Engel?
Yes.
Mr. Corbett?
Yes.
And Mr. Hancock?
Yes.
Motion to adopt?
Motion to adopt, Mrs. Crutch. And a second.
Second.
Mr. Waxler.
Mr. Waxler?
Yes.
Mr. Math?
Yes.
Mr. Engel?
Yes.
Mr. Corbett?
Yes.
Mr. Hancock?
Yes.
Mr. Rusty?
Yes.
And Mrs. Crutch?
Yes.
This ordinance is also adopted.
First reading by caption only, an ordinance providing for the issuance and the sale of bonds in the maximum principal amount of $2,850,000 for the purpose of refunding for debt charges, saving the city's outstanding municipal court improvement bond series 2011 dated October 4th, 2011, and declaring an emergency.
Mr. Leonard.
Thank you. Again, this is the refunded portion of what we're talking about and relates to the municipal courthouse next door. To the Council of the City of Defiance, Ohio, as fiscal officer of the City of Defiance, Ohio, I certify in connection with your proposed issue of bonds in the maximum aggregate principal amount of $2,850,000 for the purpose of refunding for debt charges savings the city's outstanding municipal court improvement bonds, Series 2011, dated October 4th, 2011, which were issued for the purpose of paying costs of constructing, furnishing, equipping, and otherwise improving a new Defiance Municipal Court facility, and clearing, preparing, and improving its site, together with all necessary appurtenances thereto. That one, the estimated life period of usefulness of the improvement described above was at the time of issuance of the city's $4.8 million municipal court improvement notes, Series 2009, dated October 6, 2009, at least 5 years. And two, the estimated maximum maturity of the bonds, calculated in accordance with sections 133.20 and 133.34A3 of the revised code, is at least December 1, 2031, which is the final maturity date for the refunded bonds and was calculated consistently with the provisions of section 133.20 of the revised code.
Thank you, Mr. Leonard. Questions for Mr. Leonard in these regards? If not, Mr. Hancock?
Just a curious question. With issuing these bonds, do they stay with the same seller or financing? Do they continue with the same lender institution?
The refunded bonds, and the institution that currently or originally bought them, no, not necessarily. They'll be openly bid to any and all comers, and the low bid will get the new bonds. Nothing would prevent them from then selling the bonds on a secondary market, but short answer would be no. The original bondholders would not necessarily be the ones that get these.
Okay. Thank you.
No further questions. Motion to suspend the call.
Motion to suspend and call, Mrs. Crutch. Second. Second. Mr. Mast.
Mr. Mast?
Yes.
Mr. Engel?
Yes.
Mr. Corbett?
Yes.
Mr. Hancock?
Yes.
Mr. Rusty?
Yes.
Mrs. Crutch?
Yes.
And Mr. Waxler?
Yes.
And a motion to adopt.
Motion to adopt.
Mr. Hancock, second.
Second.
Mrs. Crutch.
Mr. Engel?
Yes.
Mr. Corbett?
Yes.
Mr. Hancock?
Yes.
Mr. Rusty?
Yes.
Mrs. Crutch?
Yes.
Mr. Waxler?
Yes.
And Mr. Mast?
Yes.
This ordinance is also adopted.
First reading by caption only, an ordinance providing for the issuance and the sale of bonds in a maximum principal amount of $3,080,000 for the purpose of refunding for debt charges savings the city's outstanding various purpose bonds. Series 2019 dated April 26, 2019, and declaring an emergency.
Mr. Leonard.
Last one. And I might add that this is truly C-SPAN worthy material. To the Council of the City of Defiance, Ohio. As fiscal officer of the City of Defiance, Ohio, I certify in connection with your proposed issue of bonds in the maximum aggregate principal amount of $3,080,000 for the purpose of refunding for debt charges savings the city's outstanding various purpose bonds, Series 2019, dated April 26, 2019, which were issued for the purpose of paying costs of one, improving and expanding the municipal sanitary sewerage system by constructing and improving pump stations, force mains, and sanitary sewers. Two, improving the municipal waterworks system by constructing and installing a granular activated carbon treatment system at the city's water treatment plant. And 3, acquiring and installing an advanced radio metering system to be used in connection with the municipal waterworks system. That 1, the estimated life or period of usefulness of the improvements described above was at the time of issuance of the refunded bonds at least 5 years. And 2, the estimated maximum maturity of the bonds, calculated in accordance with sections 133.20 and 133.34A3 of the revised code, is at least December 1, 2029, which was calculated consistently with the provisions of section 133.20 of the revised code and the prior fiscal officer's certificates, each dated March 26, 2019.
Thank you. Do we have any questions for Mr. Leonard in these regards?
No further questions, motion to suspend and call.
We have a motion to suspend and call Mr. Mast and a second.
Second,
Mr. Corbett?
Mr. Hancock,
Yes.
Mr. Rusty,
Yes.
Mrs. Crutch.
Yes.
Mr. Wexler,
Yes.
Mr. Mast,
Yes.
Mr. Engel,
Yes.
and Mr. Corbett.
yes.
Motion to adopt.
A motion to adopt Mrs. Crutch. Second, Mr. Engel?
Mr. Rusty,
Yes.
Mrs. Crutch.
Yes.
Mr. Wexler,
Yes.
Mr. Mast,
Yes.
Mr. Engel,
Yes.
Mr. Corbett,
Yes.
and Mr. Hancock.
Yes.
And this ordinance is also adopted.
First reading by caption only, a resolution accepting amounts and rates as determined by the Budget Commission and authorizing the necessary tax levies to certify them to the county auditor.
Mr. Leonard?
Yes, thank you. This is a housekeeping item we do every year at the request of the county auditor and the county budget commission. And it relates to the current property tax rates and the estimated amounts of collections that they anticipate for 2021. And the council is asked to accept those amounts and rates as determined by the budget commission. The dollar amounts are virtually identical to what we approved a year ago. $883,200 is what we did last year. It's a $700 increase this year.
Sure, thank you. Do we have any questions for Mr. Leonard? Without any questions, what are council's wishes? Mr. Engel?
Motion been called.
We have a motion to suspend and call.
Second.
Second, Mr. Mast.
Mrs. Crutch,
Yes.
Mr. Wexler,
Yes.
Mr. Mast,
Yes.
Mr. Engel,
Yes.
Mr. Corbett,
Yes.
Mr. Hancock,
Yes.
and Mr. Rusty.
Yes.
And motion to adopt,
So moved.
Mr. Corbett. And second, Mr. Engel.
Mr. Wexler,
Yes.
Mr. Mast,
Yes.
Mr. Engel,
Yes.
Mr. Corbett,
Yes.
Mr. Hancock,
Yes.
Mr. Rusty,
Yes.
and Mrs. Crutch.
Yes.
This resolution is also adopted.
First reading by caption only, a resolution accepting the Defiance County Budget Commission's alternate plan of apportionment of undivided local government funds.
And Mr. Leonard.
Thank you. The county, the city, and ultimately through the county, receives money from the state of Ohio, affectionately known as local government funds, technically the undivided local government funds. The Ohio Revised Code specifies the way in which that money is to be allocated to subdivisions within the county and the county itself. It also provides that each county, with the approval of all of its subdivisions, can devise a formula of its own for the allocation of those funds. And Defiance County has for years, if not decades, chosen an alternate formula. And this is the request of the county auditor for the city to approve once again that alternate formula and take the share that it generates. Just for the record, this number has is projected to go down a little bit in 2021. In 2020, we passed this resolution in the amount of $178,710. The current estimate is the $157,580, so a little over $20,000 less. I suspect that relates to the impact on the state's budget related to the coronavirus pandemic.
Thank you. Do we have any questions for Mr. Leonard in these regards?
No further questions, no suspend and call.
Motion to suspend and call, Mr. Waxler.
Second.
Second, Mr. Hancock.
Mr. Mass?
Yes.
Mr. Ringo?
Yes.
Mr. Corbett?
Yes.
Mr. Hancock?
Yes.
Mr. Rusty?
Yes.
Mrs. Crutch? Yes. And Mr. Waxler?
Yes.
And motion to adopt, Mr. Engel.
Motion to adopt. Second.
Second, Mr. Mast.
Mr. Engel?
Yes.
Mr. Corbett?
Yes.
Mr. Hancock?
Yes.
Mr. Rusty?
Yes.
Mrs. Crutch? Mr. Waxler?
Yes.
And Mr. Mass?
Yes.
And this resolution is also adopted. It was quite a series, Mr. Leonard. Good work. With that out of the way, before we head to citizens' concerns, we do have a study session for this evening on low-powered and underpowered vehicles. Mr. O'Donnell.
Well, thank you, Mr. President. And last we spoke on this topic, you had an ordinance before you. And that ordinance did not allow these alternative vehicles, these low-speed, under-speed utility trucks and such vehicles on any state highway. And that was modeled after the Napoleon ordinance that kept those vehicles off of their main north-south thoroughfare, which was Scott Street. And then there had been some discussion about possibly allowing these vehicles in the city of Defiance over some of the bridges that were 35 miles per hour or less. And I believe it was at that point that Mr. Engel made the motion to table the ordinance for further discussion on either that issue or any other concerns about alternate vehicles. And then just last week, Mrs. Crutch had called for this study session to discuss these vehicles in more detail. So that's kind of where we are right now. If you wish to bring the ordinance back, the proper means of doing so would be to either take this ordinance off the table, or you can direct me to draft a whole new ordinance that says, that has different subject or different material inside of it.
Mrs. Crutch.
I guess my concern is more of allowing these vehicles to be able to go over to Pontiac Park or to some of the other parks, because we want to build basically our community. We want people to come downtown. We want them to be able to come to these events or whatever. And if we have someone that has a low-speed vehicle on the north side, then they would not be able to come downtown to participate in that kind of a vehicle. You know, so when I think of what we're trying to bring as far as a community-based environment, you know, to our downtown areas, to me, I think it's kind of moot to not allow them to be able to cross East 2nd Street Bridge or the North Clinton Bridge. And when I checked on some police reports for the last 5 years, there's only been like 2 pedestrian accidents on the North Clinton Street Bridge and 1 that was on the East 2nd Street Bridge from the last 5 years. And that's a pedestrian. And we're wanting bicycles to come downtown, and we have a bicycle path. You know, and to me, when we think of safety procedures, you know, a lot of the bicyclists at least have helmets on, but this is a low-speed vehicle that's going to have safety precautions inside the vehicle with seat belts and whatever. So, you know, when I feel like we're saying, yes, you can do bicycles, and no, you can't have low-speed vehicles, and to me, it doesn't comprehend for me why we wouldn't allow both of those to be able to come downtown.
Mr. Rusty.
I think the last language that we had on the table basically is sufficient for what we want. I think it addresses what the 4 alternate vehicles can do on the roads in Defiance, and it also promotes safety because in essence, we keep them off the main thoroughfare other than to cross over the bridges and then immediately go onto the first street to the right as soon as they cross over. So I think it defines where we're at, and I think it makes it safe. I think it's good language.
Mr. Engel?
With the bridge situation, I don't agree with that. I don't think we should do that. I've been across that bridge. Other than Sunday morning, there's nobody up that early, which could probably happen. But if you take during the days, mid-afternoon towards evening and that is going to be a big cluster. I don't think we should allow them over the bridges. You're not supposed to be on a state highway to begin with. And if it comes down to where we're gonna let golf carts, the other unconventional vehicles go, I will not be in support of that.
Mr. Corbett?
And I understand what Mrs. Crutch, Mr. Urussis are saying, but I also know that we listened to Chief Schaefer talk about his concern about these vehicles on bridges. So I think we need to probably listen to his recommendation and not adopt the bridge crossings. As his ordinance stands, I can't support it.
Mr. Mast?
Now, with regards to what Chief Schaefer had said, I think I'd like to see this kept to a 25-mile-per-hour zone as opposed to 35 if we're gonna do anything. But even he said there could be special dispensations for South Jackson in order to get to the reservoir, or even, I mean, I would be against a special dispensation to cross Clinton to get to Pontiac Park. I can just see the traveling on Jefferson Avenue though, that to cross that road, that's a long, long distance. And you know, if somebody gets impatient behind them, next thing you're gonna have is an LSV over in the pedestrian side lane to get out of the way to allow, you know, trucks and cars that are losing their patience to go around. So I do have an issue with, you know, Jefferson and Second Street. And Second Street being a larger bridge, it's pretty heavily trafficked because you can get to the east side by Hopkins Street, which is a 25-mile-per-hour, and then you can cut down and get to Kingsbury relatively easy going that route. So that's, for me, I'd like to see 25 mile per hour and kept off the 35 streets.
Mr. Hancock?
Yeah, I agree with Mr. Mass. I think we could maintain the 25, have some exclusions per se for, let's say, the Clinton Street Bridge, and let's say South Jackson. We can also put those in the criteria. But I also agree with Mrs. Crush where we want to develop a outgoing community, and if I'm in a low speed vehicle from where I'm at currently, where I live, I'm unable to go to Pontiac Park, where something like this may allow me to go to Pontiac Park and spend time there. Or see, all depends on where everybody's living. If you're on the north side and we don't allow anything to cross North Clinton Street Bridge, the only place that they're able to be from a park standpoint is Deal Park or Pontiac Park. They wouldn't be able to come downtown. And same for those that are living to the south of the bridge. They're not able to go to the north side. So I think the 25 would allow that. And that's, I would support something of that nature.
Mr. Engel?
Mr. O'Donnell, going across the Clinton Street Bridge, isn't that a main highway?
It is, yes.
Straight route.
So they can't be on there as far as if it's a main highway or that, am I right?
Well, that was only under your authority as the legislative body
Right.
to restrict
Right.
these vehicles. You can always change that.
Right,
You just can't go above a 35 mile per hour speed.
right. But they're not allowed to travel on like a main highway that's 35 or over or anything like, they can go across it.
They cannot travel on a highway with a posted speed limit, with an established speed limit of above 35 miles per hour.
Okay.
That's your ceiling that you are permitted to allow.
Right.
Mr. Esty?
I think the language is, or the definition is traveling. And I don't believe that what we're encouraging is traveling. What we're talking about is just a crossover of the bridge. You go 4th Street over the Clinton Street and then onto River Road. There's alternative ways of doing it. You don't have to travel down Jefferson to cross over the Jefferson Bridge. You can also go the backside too, as long as you know what you can and can't do. It's just the traveling is what the definition of the word that we're trying to avoid.
So someone did make that argument, I believe it might have been Mr. Hahn, that if you're crossing a bridge, under the revised code, one of these vehicles is permitted to cross at cross at one of these streets above 35 miles per hour, just not travel along it. So he proposed that crossing a bridge was the equivalent of just crossing the highway, not necessarily traveling on the highway. So,
Right.
I mean, I suppose you could work that into the definition somehow or allow for that in the legislation.
Mr. Corbett?
I understand that's Mr. Hahn's definition. What's the legal definition? Has there been any case law for that? What's crossover versus driving upon? Because when I think about it, when you get on that bridge, you're not crossing over, you're driving upon.
And I mean, I'm sure there would be some case law, but I think it would be something that you would decide as a body.
Then are we gonna violate the Ohio Revised Code by doing that?
It would not, because that bridge there is 25 miles per hour. Either way you look at it.
Clinton Street Bridge is 25 mile an hour?
Yes.
Wow. I'm looking at you.
Mrs. Crutch?
So basically, crossing over the bridge is the same thing as crossing across the street, of a highway, the same way.
That's what that's what a concerned citizen has proposed.
So if you're saying the bridge and the street is this, to me, it's the same thing. If you're gonna cross over Jefferson, I understand, the 35 miles per hour, but I don't know. I just feel like the whole idea of the community for downtown Defiance and bringing some events and whatever, I'd like to see more of those things coming in. We want, like I said, we want the bicyclers to come in. We want I see kids on motorized scooters going down the middle of the street, and I don't think that's right. I see motorcycles buzzing down the street without helmets, to me, is that safe? So when we're talking about safety, this is confined inside of a vehicle. And I understand that motorcycles can go faster than 35, but is it the speed that we're worried about, or is it the vehicle that we're worried about?
Other questions or comments?
Mr. President, one thing that we did have to clarify after our last meeting, we did check with the city engineer based on some of the comments about going out to the reservoir. And there are paths where vehicles can traverse out there, but the shared use paths themselves, both at the reservoir and other points in the city, like under the new Clinton Street Bridge, they are not built to these low and underspeed alternate vehicle specifications. So I would strongly discourage you from permitting them on the paths themselves. They just won't hold up very long if you allow them on those.
Mr. Ingram?
I don't have a problem with the vehicles going in neighborhood spots. I don't have a problem with that. But I do have the problem with them traveling on main highways, going across bridges and things like that. Other than if you got the bridge over there by the funeral home, Hopkins Street, that wouldn't be a problem as far as I'm concerned. But the other ones, if the traffic's going too fast, and I just don't, there's too much traffic on it. I just can't see us doing that in Clinton in East Second, so.
Mr. Rusty?
What changes would you have to make to the language that we have on the table right now based on what you've heard today?
I would, Mr. Esty, I would amend the 35, or based on your motion or somebody's motion, I would probably amend the 35 to the 25 mile per hour limit. So far, that's all I have. And then if there's if council desires any change as far as what constitutes crossing a highway, but if the ordinance that was tabled, I believe, did permit these vehicles to cross bridges under that speed threshold. And so it would really be just a matter of lowering the speed limit. Memory serves correct. I had that in the legislation, and then it was tabled.
I believe so. Mr. Engel?
I really like to see us take crossing the bridges out of that, if that's what we gotta do. It just scares the heck out of me going across East Second Street in North Clinton because of the traffic on those.
Mr. Rusty?
I don't agree with that, but I think what you need to do, Mr. O'Donnell, I'm not gonna say what your business is on this, but if there are some things that differ from what's on the table already, what we should do is take a vote to see if that is something that should be excluded or be made a part of the language. In this case, there is a suggestion about eliminating the fourth type of vehicles off of the bridges. So I guess crossing the bridges, so I guess we can start there if that's what you want to do. I don't know how you wanted to do this, but.
Well, I mean, I have earlier drafts that prohibit that, Mr. Rusty, and then I have a draft that permits these vehicles only to cross and then make an immediate right-hand turn. So I mean, I'm really not in a position where I can make that decision.
And that's what I'm saying. Do you request a motion to that as an amendment? I guess I'm just trying to move on. I know what we're doing is we're stuck in a couple items, and I think what we want to do is move on from that. If we're gonna eliminate something, then we should make a motion to eliminate off the language so that we can get the final language if we're gonna bring it to a vote. Because I don't know how else we can do it at this point.
So right now, you could direct me to produce legislation, since something's already been tabled. You can direct me to produce legislation that does or does not allow these vehicles on our bridges. I mean, that's up to you. And you can, if you wish to allow them on the bridges, you can either direct me to produce new legislation or move to take the existing legislation off the table. It really gets you to the same place. If you don't want, it's kind of like choose your own adventure. If you don't want them on the bridges, then you can just direct me to draft the legislation to that effect, and I will produce that.
So you'd be amending the last language that's on the table at this point that allows vehicles to cross bridges.
Well, at this point, you don't really need an amendment, only because there's no legislation before you.
Right.
I can just produce it anew. So you wouldn't need a motion to amend. You would just need a motion just for me to bring it in general.
Mr. Mast?
What are the speed limits of the bridges specifically now?
Well, Clinton Street is 25. East 2nd
35.
is 35. And South Jackson is, I believe the established speed limit is 35.
Oh, Jefferson Avenue.
Jefferson, not Jackson.
I'm sorry, Jefferson, yeah.
It's 35.
And obviously Hopkins is 25.
Yes.
So I'd like to see, can I make a motion that we see an ordinance that restricts these to 25 mile per hour zones and 25 mile per hour bridges?
Yep, you sure can.
So we have a motion that Mr. O'Donnell produce legislation restricting low-powered and underpowered vehicles to be confined to 25 mile an hour and under streets.
Yes.
Bridges
Beg pardon?
and bridges, or just streets?
That would be the streets, the bridge is a street, I guess, so
Yeah, that'd be his motion.
that would confine them to any 25-mile-per-hour bridge.
And that would include state highways and any street with, that's a established speed limit of 25 miles per hour or less.
Yeah, because you're not gonna see any state highways at 25 or less probably unless you're on
Well, I mean, Clinton Street would
downtown.
fit that, yeah.
Clinton Street's 25.
What is Clinton, 25 or 35?
On the bridge, I believe it's 25.
Okay, so then
Once
we
you get up
have,
the hill, it turns to 30.
we have Clinton and we have the,
Hopkins.
Hopkins Street.
And Hopkins is 25.
so yeah, that would
So we
be-
do have the motion.
And still restrict I'd like to see the downtown restricted, not on Clinton except across the bridge, I guess is my point.
Well, that's state highways.
That's state highways, yeah.
Yes, so
Be the
stay
same
with the
thing
state
on-
highway thing, just add for the allowance to cross the bridge there.
Sounds like that might be what we had, except that it's 25, it's now 25 miles per hour.
Right.
Other
Yeah,
than what's
basically-
35.
Well, I
That
think
sounds like the essential change.
more bridges were trying to be included previously,
Sure.
I guess.
Still got all your bridges included. What you just said allows all the bridges,
No,
all except Jefferson.
No.
and Second Street.
Second Street's 25 till you get across the bridge, that's 35.
Where's that?
They raised all that, I'm not sure.
Yeah.
East Second Street's 35 mile an
Once you
hour.
cross the bridge,
Till you get across the bridge, then it's 25. Yes, it is.
The bridge is 35 and then the street is 25?
You don't see a 25 mile an hour sign until you get across the bridge going into town.
Coming
Oh, come
in.
on.
In the town, I was
Yeah.
thinking
Yes.
heading
Got you,
east.
got you.
Okay.
And then
Travel
you
that all
also-
the time.
You also exclude Jefferson if you go with if you do 25 instead.
You're only letting them go across one bridge, so why even do it?
Well, we do have a motion on the floor for this ordinance. Do we have a second?
I'll second it.
Okay. We have a second. Mr. Hancock?
Question again, just for clarity, what were the bridges that are able to cross?
I'm recommending Clinton Street and Hopkins Street, because they're 25.
Okay,
I don't think that's right.
Mr. Rusty?
yes.
Mrs. Crutch?
Yes,
Mr. Waxler?
No,
Mr. Mass?
Yes.
Mr. Engel?
No,
Mr. Corbett?
No,
And Mr. Hancock?
Yes.
Okay. So would you draw up some legislation to that effect, Mr. O'Donnell?
I will, Mr. President.
With that, are there any other issues to be discussed during the study session? If not, the only thing we have really left on the agenda is citizens' concerns. Do any members of council have any emails or texts, any letters that citizens have asked you to read or present during citizens' concerns? I do not. All right. Without any, do we have a motion to adjourn for this evening?
So moved.
So moved. Do we have a second?
Second.
All those in favor of adjourning for this evening, say aye.
I
All those opposed, nay. We are adjourned for the evening.
Please choke. We'll get there, I'll get that ordinance number corrected.
I already changed it with my pen.